The Rule of 10. How one simple principle can help you retire a decade earlier than your peers. There's a window in life that most people completely miss without even realizing it. It's not your 20s when you're building your career. It's not your 30s when you're raising a family. It's something far more valuable, the healthiest years of your senior life. That period, typically somewhere in your mid 50s to early 60s, when you still have the physical energy, mental sharpness, and personal freedom to actually do the things you've been putting off your entire life. And here's what's tragic. Most people waste it entirely. They keep showing up to work even when they don't have to. They tell themselves just a few more years. They wait, and then one day they wake up in their mid 60s, finally ready to step away, and they realize their body has started slowing down. The trip they always talked about is now too physically demanding. The hobbies they plan to pick up feel harder than expected. The vibrant chapter they imagined has quietly shrunk into whatever years remain before real health challenges set in. That doesn't have to be your story. Think about the people you know who retired later than they planned. Not because they had to financially, but because they just kept pushing the date back. One more year of savings, one more promotion, one more project they wanted to see through. And then quietly, almost invisibly, their health shifted. Maybe it was a back problem that made long flights miserable. Maybe it was a knee that turned hiking into something painful rather than joyful. Maybe it was energy levels that just weren't what they used to be. The retirement they had imagined, full of adventure and spontaneity, became a quieter, more limited version of that dream. Not because they ran out of money, because they ran out of time in the right kind of health. That's the real retirement risk that nobody talks about enough. And what makes this pattern so common is that the pressure to keep working rarely comes from genuine financial necessity. It comes from something more subtle. It comes from a cultural story we've all absorbed about what responsible, serious people do. Responsible people maximize their savings. Responsible people don't leave money on the table. Responsible people work until the conventional age, and then, only then, do they permit themselves to rest. That story feels sensible on the surface, but when you examine it honestly against the realities of aging and health, it starts to look less like wisdom and more like an assumption nobody ever stopped to question. The financial industry reinforces this story constantly. Every calculator, every retirement planning tool, every article about whether you've saved enough quietly nudges you toward working longer, more years of contributions, more years of compounding, higher probability of success. The math always seems to favor one more year. But the math never accounts for the cost on the other side. The cost measured not in dollars, but in the quality and quantity of healthy time you actually get to live. Let's start with some numbers that deserve serious attention. The World Health Organization tracks something called HALE, Healthy Average Life Expectancy. It's different from overall life expectancy. HALE measures how many years of genuinely healthy, fully functional life a person can realistically expect. For Americans, that number sits at about 66.1 years. Let that sink in for a second. This doesn't mean Americans die at 66. It means the average American encounters a significant health event, a serious diagnosis, a cardiovascular event, or the beginning of a chronic condition, right around age 66 or 67. That's roughly 13 months after the traditional retirement age of 65. So, if your plan is to retire at 65 and then enjoy 2 or 3 decades of active retirement, the statistical reality is that you're looking at about 1 year of genuinely healthy, mobile, energetic retirement before health complications enter the picture. That's not pessimism. That's just what the data shows. Now, some people beat those odds. Some people stay sharp and mobile into their 80s. But here's the problem. You can't know in advance whether you'll be one of them. You can't know if you have 5 healthy years left or 20, and that uncertainty is exactly why retirement timing deserves far more strategic thought than most people give it. What makes this even more sobering is how gradually health changes happen. It's rarely dramatic. It's rarely a single moment where everything shifts overnight. It's more like a slow tide coming in. One year you're doing everything fine. A couple years later, you notice you get tired a little faster. A few years after that, recovery from physical activity takes longer. The changes are subtle enough that you barely notice them happening, but looking back over a decade, the difference is significant. And once that window has closed, no amount of money brings it back. Your family medical history adds another layer to this. Population level statistics tell you about averages, but your personal history tells you about your specific risk profile. If your parents or grandparents dealt with serious health events in their 50s or 60s, that's relevant information. Heart disease, certain cancers, diabetes, neurological conditions, these run in families. If your history suggests elevated risk, then banking on average outcomes is a gamble you probably shouldn't take. And it's worth being honest with yourself here, because people tend to be optimistic about their own health in ways that aren't always realistic. It's human nature to assume you'll be one of the lucky ones who stays healthy and active well into old age. Some people will be, but relying on that assumption as the foundation of your entire retirement plan is risky in a way that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically gets. There's also a less discussed but equally important dimension to this: the relationship between chronic stress and long-term health. Decades of research have consistently shown that prolonged occupational stress accelerates aging in measurable ways. It affects cardiovascular health, immune function, sleep quality, and cognitive sharpness. People who work high-stress jobs into their 60s are often not just losing years of retirement, they're actively shortening the healthy years they do have. The body keeps score, as they say, and years of accumulated workplace stress show up eventually in ways that no retirement savings account can undo. This is where the rule of 10 comes in. The concept is straightforward. Figure out how many genuinely healthy, active years you can realistically expect in retirement. Then structure your retirement around actually experiencing those years while you're still capable of enjoying them. 10 years is a useful benchmark. Not a magic number, but a meaningful one. 10 healthy years is long enough to travel seriously, pursue real hobbies, spend meaningful time with grandchildren, and work through a genuine bucket list. It's realistic for many people, even those with some family health risk factors, but you don't get those 10 years by retiring whenever it feels convenient. You get them by being intentional about when you step away. Here's something worth understanding about how most retirement planning works and where it falls short. The industry focuses almost entirely on money. Do you have enough? What's your withdrawal rate? What does your Monte Carlo simulation say? These are legitimate questions, but they're not the most important ones. The most important question is this: how do I structure my financial life so I actually experience my healthiest senior years rather than spending them at a desk? Most retirement plans are built with extremely conservative assumptions. Planners want to maximize your probability of never running out of money, even under the most pessimistic scenarios. That's well-intentioned, but it has a consistent side effect. It pushes people toward working longer than they actually need to. Before going further, it's worth clearing up a few widespread retirement myths that keep people chained to their desks unnecessarily. The first myth is that you need $1 million to retire. This number has become almost a cultural reflex, something people repeat without really questioning it. But only about 10 to 15% of Americans reach that threshold by retirement age. If $1 million were truly required, the overwhelming majority of Americans would simply never retire. That's obviously not what happens. People retire successfully all the time with significantly less. Your actual retirement needs depend on your lifestyle, your location, your income sources, and your real expenses, not on an arbitrary round number. The more useful question is whether your combined income, Social Security, any pension, investment withdrawals, maybe some part-time work, covers your actual living costs with a reasonable cushion. That's a completely different calculation, and it often leads to a very different answer. It's also worth recognizing where the $1 million myth comes from. Financial media has an incentive to keep people saving and investing. Brokerage firms and fund companies benefit when people stay engaged with their portfolios for as long as possible. This doesn't mean the advice is malicious. A lot of it is genuinely well intentioned. But there are structural reasons why the financial industry tends to overstate how much you need before it's safe to stop working. Being aware of that dynamic helps you evaluate the advice you're getting with clearer eyes. The second myth is treating the 4% withdrawal rule as an absolute law. The rule came from academic research in the mid 1990s showing that withdrawing 4% of your portfolio in year one, then adjusting for inflation each year after, gave retirees a very high probability of never depleting their savings over a 30-year period. That was meaningful research. But somewhere along the way, it became treated as gospel rather than as one useful reference point among several. A slightly higher withdrawal rate, say 4.5% or even 5%, might carry a modestly lower probability of success under simulated scenarios. Whether that trade off makes sense depends entirely on your personal circumstances, your flexibility, and what you're giving up by working longer to achieve that extra margin of certainty. The third myth is how people interpret probability of success in retirement projections. When a financial plan shows an 85% probability of success, many people mentally translate that as 85% chance everything is fine, 15% chance of financial ruin. That's not what it means. What it actually means is that under 85% of simulated economic scenarios, you never need to make any adjustments at all. Under the remaining 15%, you'd need to make some modifications, perhaps delaying a planned trip, temporarily reducing discretionary spending, picking up some part time consulting work for a year or two. These are adjustments, not catastrophes. Think about how a pilot lands a plane. They don't lock in one fixed approach and refuse to deviate. They're constantly making small corrections, nudging up, adjusting down, guiding the aircraft to a smooth landing. Retirement works the same way. An 80% probability of success doesn't mean either perfection or disaster. It means you're likely on track with a reasonable chance you'll need to make some modest course corrections along the way. Here's the part that changes everything. There is a 100% certainty that working extra years to push your probability from 85% to 97% will cost you genuinely healthy time you can never get back. Say you could retire at 58 with an 85% probability of success, or work 4 more years and retire at 62 with a 97% probability. The mathematical difference looks appealing on paper, but the actual cost is 4 years of your healthiest senior years. 4 years of travel you won't take. 4 years with grandchildren when you have the energy to actually get on the floor with them. 4 years of pursuing the things you've been postponing. Is eliminating a small statistical risk worth that trade? Only you can answer. But it's the question that actually matters, and most retirement planning never asks it. And here's something else worth sitting with. The people who work those extra 4 years rarely feel they gained 4 years of meaningful professional contribution. More often, they feel they just extended an obligation. The work doesn't suddenly become more fulfilling because you've told yourself you're doing it for financial security. Those years still have a cost in energy, in freedom, in the quiet accumulation of things you kept putting off. And unlike financial costs, you can't earn those years back later. There's a concept in economics called opportunity cost. The idea that every choice has a hidden cost, which is the value of the best alternative you gave up by making that choice. When applied to retirement timing, the opportunity cost of working an extra year isn't just a year of salary you didn't need. It's a year of freedom you didn't take, a year of mornings you could have spent doing something meaningful rather than commuting, a year of weekdays that belonged entirely to you rather than to an employer. Most people calculate retirement readiness by adding up what they have. Almost nobody calculates it by honestly accounting for what they're giving up by waiting. Once you start thinking in those terms, the calculus often shifts significantly. So, how do you put this into practice? Start with an honest assessment of your health outlook. Have a real conversation with your doctor, not asking them to predict your lifespan, but asking about your specific risk factors given your family history, genetics, and current health. Take that information seriously. If your family history is clean and you're in good shape, you might have more flexibility. If there are warning signs in your history, that information should carry real weight in your planning. Then define your window. Maybe it's 55 to 65, maybe 60 to 70. Choose the stretch of years you want to protect and commit to actually experiencing them while you're still healthy and mobile. This isn't a vague aspiration, it's a concrete target that shapes everything else you decide financially. Work backward from there. If you want 10 active years starting at 58, your retirement target is 58. That becomes your North Star, the fixed point everything else gets built around. Not a target you'll revisit when the market does something unexpected. Not a date that keeps sliding forward. A real, committed goal. Only then do you look at your finances. Do you have enough to support that target? If yes, you're on track. If not, you have real options. Saving more aggressively, planning some part time income in early retirement, adjusting your spending expectations, or shifting your target retirement age slightly. The key is that you're making these trade offs deliberately, with clear eyes, not just drifting towards 65 because that's what everyone does. It's also worth thinking seriously about what early retirement actually looks like in practice, because many people carry an outdated mental image of it. Retirement doesn't have to mean stopping entirely. Many people who retire in their late 50s find themselves doing more meaningful and engaging work than they ever did in their careers, just on their own terms, on their own schedule, without someone else setting the agenda. Consulting, creative projects, volunteering, starting something small they always wanted to try. The difference is that these activities are chosen, not required. That distinction changes everything about how they feel. Once you've set your target, the financial planning shifts focus. Instead of asking how to maximize probability of success, you start asking how to build flexibility into your plan so adjustments are easy if they become necessary. That might mean building multiple income streams, social security, some part time consulting, rental income, so you're not entirely dependent on market performance. It might mean keeping 2 to 3 years of expenses in accessible savings so you never have to sell investments at the worst possible time. It might mean deciding in advance which discretionary spending you'd reduce first if needed, so you have a plan rather than a crisis. Not because you expect things to go wrong, but because having thought through these scenarios in advance means you can navigate them calmly rather than reactively. Healthcare is another practical consideration that early retirees need to plan for carefully. If you retire before 65, you're not yet eligible for Medicare, which means you need a strategy for covering health insurance during that gap. This is a real cost that needs to be factored into your retirement budget, honestly. Options include marketplace coverage through the Affordable Care Act, continuing coverage through a former employer, a spouse's employer plan if applicable, or health sharing arrangements. None of these are perfect, but all of them are workable with proper planning. The key is not letting this practical challenge become the reason you stay in a job years longer than you need to. The cost of bridge health insurance, while real, is almost always smaller than the cost in time and well being of delaying retirement unnecessarily. There's also a psychological dimension here that pure math misses entirely. Retiring at 58 versus 62 isn't just a difference in calendar years. It's the difference between stepping into retirement with energy and enthusiasm versus arriving exhausted after extending your working life longer than you wanted. It's the difference between pursuing your goals at full capacity versus at reduced capacity. The mental and emotional quality of those years is inseparable from when you start them. There's something else worth naming here, too. The people who retire earlier often report that the decision itself, the act of choosing to prioritize their health and time over incremental financial gains, feels like reclaiming something important, like finally acting in alignment with what they actually value rather than what they were supposed to value. That shift in perspective has real effects on well being that go beyond anything a financial model can measure, and the social environment around early retirement is shifting too. A generation ago, retiring in your late 50s was unusual enough to invite raised eyebrows. Today, the concept of retiring earlier and living more intentionally has become far more visible and far more normalized. More people are openly discussing the trade offs involved in conventional retirement timing. More people are questioning whether working until 65 is actually the responsible choice or just the default one. That cultural shift matters because it reduces one of the most irrational but powerful barriers to early retirement: the fear of being perceived as doing something unconventional. Fear is often what keeps people working long past when they need to. Fear of outliving their money, fear of losing the identity that work provides, fear of boredom, fear of what others will think. These fears are real and they deserve honest examination. But it's worth looking at each one clearly. The fear of running out of money is the most common and, in many cases, the most overstated. With flexible spending, multiple income sources, and a willingness to make modest adjustments when needed, the financial risk of retiring a few years earlier than conventional wisdom suggests is often far smaller than it feels. The fear of losing identity is real, but it's also solvable. And the solution is building meaningful pursuits outside of work before you retire, not staying at work indefinitely. The fear of boredom almost universally turns out to be unfounded. People with adequate resources and genuine interests rarely report boredom in retirement. They typically report the opposite. There's never enough time for everything they want to do. The fear of judgment from others is perhaps the least rational of all, but it's more common than people admit. The honest answer is that the people whose opinions matter most will likely admire the intentionality of the decision once they understand it. At the end of all this analysis, the choice comes down to something personal. Do you want to prioritize absolute financial certainty, even if it means giving up years of genuinely healthy retirement? Or do you want to prioritize actually living those years, accepting that you might need to make some adjustments down the road? Neither answer is universally right. Someone with exceptional health, low job stress, and genuine satisfaction in their work might reasonably choose to stay longer. That's a valid path. But for most people, when they honestly weigh the trade offs, the risk of needing to adjust spending later feels more acceptable than the certainty of losing years they'll never get back. The rule of 10 isn't about retiring recklessly or ignoring financial reality. It's about retiring intentionally, with a clear eyed understanding of what's actually at stake on both sides of the decision. It's about recognizing that time and good health is the scarcest resource in this entire equation, scarcer than money, scarcer than opportunity, and the one thing you absolutely cannot manufacture more of once it's gone. And perhaps most importantly, it's about making a conscious choice rather than a passive one. The default path, working until the conventional age because that's simply what people do, is itself a choice. It's just a choice made by inertia rather than intention. The rule of 10 asks you to make the choice deliberately, with full awareness of what you're trading and what you're gaining, rather than arriving at retirement age one day and realizing that the window you always imagined enjoying has quietly become smaller than you planned. Your senior years, the years when you finally have freedom, when you can pursue what you've always postponed, when you can show up fully for the people and experiences that matter most, are genuinely finite and genuinely precious. The only question is whether you'll plan for them in a way that reflects how much they actually matter. Plan for them accordingly.